Mark stood before the blank canvas, his brush hovering inches from the surface. The light in the room was thin, cutting through the dust motes that danced in the stagnant air. He stared at the weave of the fabric, his knuckles white as he tightened his grip on the wooden handle. Beside the easel lay a heavy, gray sheet, folded into a stiff pile on the floor. It had covered this frame for 3 years. Every day the room remained exactly as he left it. The brush did not descend. His arm stayed locked in the air, trembling slightly under the weight of his own hesitation. He listened to the clock on the wall. The second hand swept forward, marking time with a sharp, mechanical click that echoed against the cramped corners of his workspace. He looked down at the floor, at the scattered tubes of dried paint, and then back at the stark, white void staring back at him. The silence of the room was heavy, pressing against his shoulders. He tried to force his hand downward, but his muscles refused to obey. He stood frozen, caught between the urge to begin and the crushing pressure of the empty space. 3 years of waiting had led to this single, motionless moment. He knew the excuses by heart. They were a script he had rehearsed for over 1,000 days. He told himself he would paint once he secured a studio with vaulted ceilings and natural light pouring in from the north. He told himself he needed a set of professional brushes, the kind that held ink with grace, not these frayed things currently clutched in his hand. He believed that art required a sanctuary, a place where every variable was controlled and every shadow was placed with intent. This cramped corner was not that place. The light here was murky, filtered through a single grime-streaked window. The floorboards groaned under his weight, and the smell of stale coffee and damp paper filled the room. He convinced himself that starting here, with these insufficient tools, would be an insult to the craft. He wanted the outcome to be flawless, so he demanded the process be perfect. He held the brush steady, his mind racing through the inventory of what he lacked. He weighed his current reality against a future that existed only in his head. The gap between the two felt like a chasm. He waited for a signal, a shift in the wind, or a sign that the conditions were finally right. None came. The perfection he chased had become a cage, and he was the one who had locked the door. The studio was not a sanctuary. It was a jagged corner of a room, carved out by stacks of unsorted paper and heavy furniture. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a sickly yellow glow that failed to reach the corners. Dust clung to the edges of the baseboards, undisturbed for months. Mark looked down at his equipment. The brushes were splayed, their bristles stiff with old, dried pigment that no longer held a point. The palette was a scarred piece of wood, pitted and stained with the ghosts of colors he had never actually used. He ran a thumb over the handle of his primary brush. The wood was splintered, biting into his skin. There was no natural light here, only the dim, amber haze of a late afternoon that refused to brighten. The grand dreams he nurtured of high ceilings, expansive windows, and pristine, organized sets dissolved into the reality of this cramped, quiet space. He saw the fraying edges of his own ambition reflected in the worn-out tools. Every item in the room was a testament to his stagnation. The reality was heavy, tangible, and entirely ordinary. He stood in the center of it all, surrounded by the debris of his own hesitation, waiting for a change that the room itself seemed incapable of offering. Mark shifted his focus away from the worn tools and fixed his eyes on the wall. A plastic clock hung there, its surface yellowed by time. The second hand moved with a sharp, mechanical click. It did not pause. It did not stutter. It swept across the dial with a cold, rhythmic indifference that filled the quiet room. He counted the beats. 1, 2, 3. Each tick was a unit of existence he could never reclaim. He tried to calculate the total, but the numbers blurred. 3 years. He had spent 1,095 days standing in this exact spot, waiting for a permission that would never arrive. He looked at the dust motes dancing in the dim light, realizing they had been swirling in the same patterns while he remained anchored to his own excuses. The clock did not care about his need for perfect lighting. It did not care that his studio was cramped or his brushes were frayed. It simply measured the life he was letting slip through his fingers. He stared until the face of the clock seemed to distort, the numbers blurring into a single, accelerating blur of lost opportunity. The silence of the room was gone, replaced by the relentless, mocking sound of the mechanism driving the seconds into the past. The ticking did not stop, but the noise in his head finally went quiet. Mark turned away from the clock. He looked at the easel, still shrouded in its layer of gray dust. He reached out and pulled the fabric down. It fell to the floor in a heap, leaving the canvas exposed and stark against the dim wall. He did not check the lighting. He did not rearrange the papers on his desk to create more room. He accepted the cramped, narrow space for exactly what it was. He reached for the handle of that brush he had held moments before. The wood was rough against his palm. The bristles splayed and uneven, but he did not set it down. He gripped it with a sudden, sharp intensity, his knuckles whitening under the pressure. The need for a better setup, for expensive tools, or for a different life simply evaporated. There was only the wood in his hand and the blank, waiting surface in front of him. He planted his feet firmly on the floorboards. He felt the weight of the brush, the resistance of his own resolve, and the finality of the decision. He was finished waiting for conditions that would never align. He was ready to begin. Mark leaned forward. The distance between the brush tip and the fabric felt like a canyon. He closed the gap. He pressed the bristles into the weave, dragging them downward with a shaky, uncertain hand. The paint caught on the texture, leaving behind a streak that was jagged, uneven, and painfully thin. It looked nothing like the vision that had occupied his mind for years. It looked like a mistake. He pulled the brush back, staring at the mark. The imperfection was a physical weight in his chest. A sudden, sharp impulse flared in his brain to grab a rag, to douse it in solvent, and to wipe the canvas back to its safe, blank state. He felt the heat rise in his cheeks. His fingers tightened on the wood, his knuckles straining as the urge to abandon the attempt surged. He looked at the edge of the easel, searching for an excuse to quit, to walk away and leave the mess behind. The room felt smaller, the dim light suddenly exposing every flaw in his movement. He stood frozen, the brush still dripping slightly, his body coiled in the tension of wanting to erase the evidence of his own lack of experience. The rag sat on the edge of the desk, within reach of his left hand. It was a simple, dirty square of fabric, promising the comfort of a clean slate. Mark looked from the rag to the jagged blue streak on the canvas. The silence of the room seemed to press in, demanding a verdict. He took a breath, the air thin and stale, and then he pulled his hand away from the rag. He would not wipe it. He would not retreat. He turned his attention to the palette, his eyes scanning the dried, crusty edges before settling on a fresh dollop of deep blue. He dipped the brush. The bristles drank the pigment, turning heavy and dark. He did not aim for precision. He did not seek the elegance he had imagined for so long. He simply leaned back into the space and brought the brush to the fabric once more. He dragged a second line across the surface, overlapping the first jagged mark. It did not fix the error, it transformed it. The blue bleed into the weave, thick and deliberate. He watched the color settle, realizing that the mess was starting to take on a life of its own. He had crossed the line. There was no going back to the blank, safe space he had occupied for years. The hours stretched out, measured not by the clock, but by the rhythm of bristles against fabric. Mark stood rooted in the cramped corner, his arm beginning to ache from the unnatural angle. His hand shook, a fine, rhythmic tremor that made every stroke unpredictable. He did not try to steady it. He let the vibration dictate the lines, turning his lack of control into a tool. Blue bled into gray, and the gray collided with the streak of ochre he had found on the palette. The air in the room grew heavy with the smell of turpentine. He stopped thinking about how it looked and started focusing on how the paint felt as it met the surface. The brush moved faster now, driven by a frantic need to occupy the empty space. Every patch of white that vanished was a small victory against the paralysis of the last 3 years. He did not wipe the mistakes. He layered over them until the canvas became a dense, tangled thicket of color. The silence of the blank space was shattered, replaced by the wet, rhythmic scraping of the brush. When he finally dropped his arm, the room felt different. The canvas was a disaster of form, but it was no longer empty. It was a beginning. Mark stepped back, his eyes darting from the chaotic mess on his easel to the glossy, professional prints he kept in a folder on his desk. The contrast was a physical blow. The work downtown was precise, luminous, and finished. His own was a jagged, muddy tangle of uncertainty. He felt the familiar weight of the word amateur settle in his throat, heavy and suffocating. He looked at the brush in his hand, now feeling like a clumsy, oversized tool. The urge to toss it aside and walk out of the room flared, sharp and sudden. He walked to the desk, his fingers hovering over the prints, tempted to compare every stroke, every shade, every failure. The silence of the studio turned judgmental. He could hear the imagined laughter of critics, the cold indifference of gallery owners. He gripped the edge of the desk until his knuckles turned white, his breath hitching in his chest. Then, he did the only thing he could. He turned his back on the desk. He walked away from the perfection he had chased for 3 years and returned to the easel. He did not look at the prints again. He looked only at the canvas, accepting the mess for what it was. His own. Morning light filtered through the grime of the studio window, illuminating the canvas. It stood in the corner, a silent, rigid challenge. Mark stood in the doorway, his hand resting on the frame of the door, watching the dust motes dance in the air. The temptation to walk past it was a physical sensation, a dull ache in his chest. He thought of the coffee waiting in the kitchen, the safety of his chair, the comfort of postponing the work until the light was better or his mind felt clearer. The easel seemed to loom larger than it had the night before. He took a step toward it, then stopped, his feet heavy as if the floor were made of lead. The friction of the moment was suffocating. He realized that someday was a ghost that haunted the room, whispering that he could always start tomorrow. He looked at the brush lying on the tray, its bristles stained with yesterday's dried pigment. He could turn back now, leave the room, and keep the dream pristine and untouched. He took a breath, the air tasting of stale paint and dust. He walked to the easel, reached out, and gripped the wood. He was no longer waiting for the perfect moment. He was choosing this one. Mark dipped the brush into the thick, wet blue. The first stroke caught on the dry texture of the canvas, resisting him. He pressed harder, his knuckles whitening, forcing the pigment to spread. For the first few minutes, every movement felt like a negotiation. His hand shook, the lines were erratic, and his wrist ached from the tension of maintaining a steady grip. He ignored the ticking clock. He ignored the dim light. He focused only on the way the bristles dragged across the rough surface, leaving a trail of color that had not existed moments before. An hour passed, then another. The initial frustration began to dissolve into a rhythmic, repetitive motion. He stopped looking at the corners of the room for validation. He stopped listening for the sound of the world outside the door. His reality narrowed down to the intersection of hair, paint, and fabric. He moved his hand, watched the color shift, and moved again. The hesitation that had defined his years of waiting evaporated under the constant, physical friction of the work. He was no longer trying to create a masterpiece. He was simply moving, one stroke after another, until the 2-hour mark arrived and he realized he had not thought of anything else at all. By the end of the week, the studio floor was littered with discarded rags and dried paint. Mark stood before the canvas, squinting at the dense, layered mess he had created. For a moment, the jumble of colors looked like nothing more than a mistake. He felt the old urge to scrape it clean, to start over with a fresh, empty surface. He reached for his palette knife, hesitated, and then set it back down. Instead, he picked up a thin brush. He began to drag lighter tones across the dark, heavy patches. He worked with a new, deliberate patience. Slowly, the thick, unorganized blobs began to recede into the background. A horizon line appeared. A hint of a tree line emerged from the shadows. The chaos was not disappearing, but it was being shaped. Every stroke demanded a decision, and every decision built a structure where there had been only uncertainty. He stepped back. The landscape was crude, but it was anchored to the canvas. The internal noise that had haunted his years of idleness finally began to quiet, replaced by the steady, rhythmic demands of the work. He was no longer fighting the paint. He was listening to the image it wanted to become. Mark stopped checking the clock for progress markers. He stopped looking at the brushwork of famous artists on his bookshelf, and he stopped measuring his output against the polished works in downtown galleries. Those metrics belonged to a version of himself that no longer existed. He stood before the easel and looked at the canvas as it was 24 hours ago. He noted the specific patch of sky, the depth of the shadow, and the way the light hit the tree line. Then he looked at the canvas now. The difference was small, a fraction of a millimeter of pigment, but it was there. That gap became his new obsession. It was the only standard that mattered. He felt a weight lift from his shoulders as the need for perfection dissolved into the necessity of constant, incremental improvement. The pressure to arrive at a masterpiece vanished, replaced by the friction of making something better than it had been the day before. He moved with a new energy, light and precise. Every stroke was a bridge between the person he was yesterday and the person he was becoming. He did not need an audience to confirm the change. The canvas was the ledger, and with every added layer, the balance tipped in his favor. The rhythm of the brush against the canvas was the only sound in the room. Mark was leaning in, mixing a touch of ochre into the foreground, when the sharp rhythmic rap of knuckles against wood cut through the air. He froze. The brush remained suspended, a drip of paint hanging precariously from the bristles. He had not heard footsteps in the hall. The door, which he had left slightly ajar for air, swung inward before he could set his palette down. The neighbor stepped across the threshold without waiting for an invitation. The transition was jarring. 1 second, Mark was deep in the private, internal logic of the landscape. The next, his cramped corner was no longer his own. The neighbor moved into the small space, the floorboards creaking under the weight of an uninvited guest. Mark stood motionless, palette in one hand and brush in the other, feeling the sudden, cold air of the outside world hit the room. His work, still wet and unvarnished, was now exposed to an observer. The privacy he had nurtured was gone. He felt the weight of a gaze shifting from his face to the canvas. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in as the silence stretched, thick and heavy with the arrival of an audience he had not prepared for. The neighbor stopped 3 feet from the easel. He did not speak. He did not shift his weight. He simply leaned forward, squinting at the layers of paint that Mark had built up over the long, quiet week. The room was deathly still. A faint smell of turpentine hung in the air, thick and sharp. Mark held his breath, his knuckles white against the wooden pallet. He waited for a critique, a question, or a scoff. He waited for the familiar urge to apologize for the mess or to explain away the uneven lines. But as the seconds ticked by, the urge never arrived. Mark looked at the back of the neighbor's head, then at the painting, and finally at his own steady hands. The judgment he had feared for 3 years suddenly felt like a distant, irrelevant thing. He realized he did not need the neighbor to validate the hours he had spent here. The brushwork, the colors, and the hours of labor belonged to him. He watched the neighbor trace the edge of a mountain ridge with his eyes, and Mark simply stood his ground. The silence was no longer a cage. It was a space he had created. He did not look away. He did not shrink. He waited, fully present, watching the neighbor watch his work. The neighbor finally exhaled. He stepped back, his eyes still locked on the canvas. "It is real," he said. The words hung in the cramped space, simple and unadorned. He pointed at the center of the landscape, where the colors bled into each other. "There is a perspective here I have not seen before. It is not like the others." Mark felt the air shift. The tension that had held his shoulders tight for years simply evaporated. He looked at the painting, truly seeing it for the first time as a separate entity, something he had brought into existence. A surge of energy moved through his chest, sharp and bracing. It was not the hollow thrill of praise, but the heavy, grounding realization of his own capacity. He had spent 3 years terrified of being an amateur, but looking at the neighbor, he realized the fear had been the only real failure. He had been so focused on the destination of perfection that he had ignored the act of walking. He set the palette down on the small table. His hands were stained with pigment. His workspace remained cluttered, but the canvas was no longer a void. He stood taller. He had survived the judgment of the world, and more importantly, he had survived his own doubt. The neighbor turned and walked out, leaving the door slightly ajar. Mark heard the heavy thud of the front door closing, then the silence returned to the studio. He stayed still, listening to the rhythm of his own breathing. He looked at the corner where the dusty sheet lay crumpled on the floor, the same sheet that had hidden the easel for 3 years. He picked it up and folded it, moving with deliberate, slow motions. The dream of a perfect studio with ideal light and professional tools felt thin now, like paper. He had waited years for the right time, the right mood, and the right skill level. He looked at his hands, marked with streaks of dried blue and yellow. They were not the hands of a master, but they were the hands that had moved the paint. He felt a steady, heavy resolve anchor him to the floor. The safe illusion of someday was gone, replaced by the friction of the present moment. He walked back to the easel, wiped a smear of dust from the frame, and reached for his palette. He did not look for better brushes. He did not look for better light. He simply picked up the palette, squeezed a fresh drop of gold onto the wood, and prepared to add another layer to the world he was building. Mark stood in the center of the room and looked at the wall where the canvas leaned. He remembered the weight of the previous 3 years, a time spent in the paralysis of anticipation. He had been terrified of the first stroke, certain that an amateur effort would invalidate his entire desire to create. Now, that terror felt distant, like a memory of a storm that had passed. He traced the uneven lines on the canvas with his eyes. The paint was thick in some places, thin in others where the brush had dragged. It was far from perfect, but it was his. He realized the fear of failure had not been a dragon to slay, but a shadow that disappeared the moment he turned on the light. The comfort of procrastination had offered safety, but it had also offered nothing to hold on to. He preferred the friction of the work now, the way the bristles pulled against the fabric, the way the colors resisted blending, the way his own hand trembled under the pressure of choice. Each flaw in the composition was a record of his decision to move forward. He had stopped asking the canvas to be flawless and started asking it to be honest. The quiet in the room was no longer hollow. It was the sound of a man working. Mark leaned over the wooden palette, his focus narrowing to the small, circular space where the colors met. He gripped his palette knife, the handle cool and worn against his palm. He drew a line of deep, earthy ochre and pulled a bright, metallic yellow into it. The two colors resisted, then yielded, folding into one another under the pressure of the blade. He worked the mixture back and forth, scraping the wood with a rhythmic, scratching sound that filled the quiet studio. He lifted the knife, watching the paint slump and hold its shape, a rich, sun-drenched gold that felt alive against the dark wood. He did not rush the process. He scraped the edges of the pile, pulling every stray fleck into the center until the shade was consistent and smooth. The movement was repetitive, deliberate, and entirely his own. He paused, holding the knife steady, and tested the viscosity by dragging a thin trail of gold across the palette's surface. It was right. He reached for a fresh brush, dipped the bristles into the mixture, and turned back to the canvas. The blank space did not exist anymore. It was a map of his own progress, and he was ready to add the next layer. Mark pressed the loaded brush against the canvas. The gold paint caught the fading light from the window, glowing with a soft, metallic intensity. Outside, the street noise rose and fell, marking the slow progression of the afternoon. He did not look up. The years would continue to cycle, seasons shifting and clocks ticking, regardless of his presence in this room. He knew this now. He had spent 3 years watching the second hand sweep across the wall, waiting for a life that never arrived. That version of himself was gone. He pulled the brush across the texture of the canvas, watching the gold trace a path through the existing colors. Each stroke took seconds, but it was time reclaimed. He was not waiting for the perfect studio or the perfect conditions. He was building his life with a palette knife and a steady hand. The room felt smaller than before, yet it contained everything he needed. He cleaned the brush, reached for another color, and continued. He had stopped observing his life from the sidelines. He was inside the frame, changing the composition, one deliberate movement at a time. The work was the life, and he was finally, fully at work.